tackle complex problems. I will now move on to my talk that we kind of decided to have as sort of an introduction to both behavior change and complexity science issues, to kind of give background to the rest of the talks in the symposium. I don't also consider myself a complexity science expert, but I've been reading in the past few years more myself into this area, and think that it is actually a promising approach and useful also for a behavior change. But to give background to those of you who are not familiar to behavior change research, I will just briefly go through some basic ideas and signpost you to actually previous BESP symposium presentations and talks if you want to familiarize yourself more. And then also briefly introduce basic concepts of complexity, and then how these might relate and be useful for intervention development, and then behavior change intervention evaluation. And we this terminology that sometimes people are thinking of systems as kind of a higher level systems like societal systems or organizations, but here we really can take, in complex system science, you can focus on various levels of complex systems, such as an individual can be treated as a complex systems, and then groups and dyads can be treated as a complex system, and interventions that are kind of embedded, that are embedded in larger complex systems. So behavior change interventions aim to change behavior of a population or group by targeting particular behaviors in order to solve a problem, like preventing an illness or environmental protection, for example, by say changing people's electricity use. And there are many examples of behavior change interventions. So you can have this one-on-one counseling of a nurse to a person with a chronic disease to change their lifestyle, or you can have these wider programs at the workplace, or persuasive media campaigns, or then more higher level regulatory societal measures. And the basic building blocks of these, of course, are that we always have to start, like, what is the behavior, and try to understand it in its context, and what are the influences on behavior that we might be able to modify in an intervention. So we might, for example, try to find out whether this population is not motivated to do a behavior and they might need a motivational intervention, or that they are motivated but they don't have resources to engage in that behavior, and then we would need to address that environmental barrier with an appropriate behavior change technique. So this is kind of the basic logic model, and oftentimes in behavior change research we then draw from formal theories that explain and predict behavior. Like, for example, Marijn just previously showed this framework where he had used theories of risk perception and then of behavioral maintenance to identify the key constructs that might play a role in predicting these COVID-relevant behaviors. I show you one model from Professor Martin Hager's presentation from the first BESP symposium. There's also a link to that presentation. This is an integrative social cognitive model that outlines various predictors of behavior. So here you see deliberative intention or motivation being predicted by a key set of beliefs like self-consistency, identity considerations, people's self-concept, whether this behavior is something who I am. Then people might assess perceived costs and benefits of that behavior. Social influence, of course, is important, so perceived norms. There's a sense of self-efficacy or confidence in one's ability to engage in the behavior. And then anticipated emotional reactions also are important according to this model. And in addition to these deliberative reflective determinants, there are implicit processes such as habits, automatic habits, routines, and implicit beliefs that play a role, and also past behavior. So this is kind of one example of behavioral science theory that can be used as basis for building an intervention to target these different determinants or influences on behavior. And then the basic model of trying to understand the mechanisms of action of behavior change interventions is here, that kind of you would study a hypothesized mediator, the modifiable psychological construct, for example, self-efficacy, for example, of being able to wash your hands correctly, and then assessing the influence of the change method or behavior change technique on that factor, and whether that factor plays a role in actually then influencing the behavioral change. And the currently we so previously a problem was in the literature of behavior change interventions that all interventions were described with different words to basically it was really difficult to compare different intervention studies to each other. So a major development was this creation of behavior change technique taxonomy that allowed comparable descriptions of different interventions. And you know, this first version of the taxonomy included 93 behavior change techniques and their definitions. So then people were able to transparently describe what they were trying to do in their behavior change interventions. And then also people were able to kind of do systematic reviews and meta-analysis, trying to find out, to identify the best techniques to change motivation and behavior in different contexts, for different populations, for different behaviors. And you know, many such meta-analyses have now been published. So for example, these are meta-analyses on intervention techniques to increase motivation for physical activity, identified several unique behavior change techniques that were associated with increases in motivation for physical activity: behavioral goal setting, self-monitoring, behavioral practice, rehearsal. But there are, of course, lots of problems also for this approach. It's not that easy, and it's not that clear always. There has been lots of discussion in the recent years of such meta-analysis. And I give you this example of self-determination theory based meta-analysis of techniques to promote motivation for health behavior change, which basically one important finding was that the meta-regression showed that individual strategies had limited independent impact on outcomes, in line actually with the self-determination theory suggestion that to support basic psychological needs, you have to use a combination of multiple co-acting techniques, already kind of paving the way to complexity approaches. Then I want to also point out to the Medical Research Council guidance for complex interventions and its extension for process evaluation. So in addition to these trials, intervention trials in RCTs that I just showed meta-analysis of in health behavior change research, it is strongly encouraged that people use both qualitative and quantitative methods to analyze the processes of interventions and trials, to understand what is the role of context for that trial and for that intervention. How is the intervention implemented? It's not, of course, always implemented as intended. And then mechanisms of impact. How do these change? Also unanticipated pathways and consequences. So these kinds of processes are acknowledged in the current literature, and trialists encouraged to study these systematically. But for the complexity science view, there has been less of that in health behavior change research. There are some texts and some articles published. This one was published in 2006, Chaotic View on Behavior Change, by Ken Resnicoe, who is actually our keynote speaker tomorrow. Ken Resnick and Roger Vaughan noted that health behavior change is often conceptualized as a linear deterministic process. And consistent with this paradigm, the statistical models have almost exclusively assumed a linear relationship between psychosocial predictors and behavior, failing to account for nonlinear quantum influences on human thought and action. And they raised this example. Why after years of false starts and failed attempts, a person succeeds at increasing their physical activity? Or why after years of success, a person relapses? And they raise these questions and limitations of the current models and theories that we have. And 2 years later, Ken was also involved in writing this piece, noting that the key relevant principles of complex adaptive systems apply to behavior change. For example, processes sensitive to initial conditions, for example, personal histories of a person. It's difficult to predict, and this change occurs within a complex adaptive system with multiple components, where results are often greater than the sum of their parts. And I remember reading these around the time when they were published. I was like, yeah, these are really good points, but how to go about kind of studying them? And then I kind of continued business as usual. But then fast forward a decade later, and then a doctoral student of mine, Matti Heino, walks in the door and says, look, we really need to take this complexity thing more seriously. And there are actually ways how to do it nowadays. I will show a bit more. So then I was like, okay, this is interesting. It probably, this change wasn't probably that kind of immediate persuasion, but after like getting to know these things and attending some trainings, reading papers, I become more and more convinced. And at the time when I was considering kind of this change, I was like, aren't we doing already complex interventions? Aren't we doing complexity? For example, this UK MRC guidance on complex interventions, that is a framework for many behavior change research projects, is kind of defining a complex intervention and calling our interventions complex. But basically what you see, how they define a complex intervention is based on the number of interactions between components in the interventions and number and difficulty of behaviors. But it has been pointed out that intervention characteristics are only one aspect of complexity, and it's really not sufficient if you think from the complexity science lens. And in fact, there is an update of this guidance going on. Professor Sharon Simpson, again signposting to a best symposium recorded talk, she gave talk last year on their work to extend MRC guidance and how they try to extend also the definition of complexity for this guidance and help researchers try to make use of complex dynamical systems approaches for such interventions. This guidance will be published this winter. So, but you can already have a look at Sharon's talk. It kind of gives the key insights there if you're interested. All right, so more toward what is complexity. Many of you might know this differentiation between simple, complicated, and complex problems. So obviously, following a recipe to cook a meal is simple, but sending a rocket to the moon is complicated, but it's not complex. Raising a child is complex. And I'm just highlighting the differences here. So if you send one rocket to the moon, you can be sure that the next will be okay as well, but doesn't apply to raising a child. Rockets are similar in critical ways, but raising a child is different because they are all very unique. And this creates also differences in the certainty of outcomes and uncertainty. But I like really this, that there's optimistic approach to problem solving in all of these problems. But coming back to the differentiation between complicated and complex problems, which of these two behavior change interventions remind more? and I think complex, maybe. I'm showing Gwen Marchant's and Jonathan Hilbert's graphical presentation of the difference between component dominant systems and interaction dominant systems. So this path model type of linear presentation, focusing on individual components, is kind of the reductionist way that many of us are thinking of behavior change and our theoretical models currently. Whereas in complex systems research, the focus is more on the micro level interactions of the components and how they interact and self-organize to produce something completely new. There are emergent properties arising from the system, and it cannot be reduced to the individual components of the problem. So these are key differences of these approaches. So why use complexity approach for intervention development? There are several intervention development frameworks which all share key tasks that I said in the beginning of the talk, in the beginning of the symposium. And basically they try to figure out a logic model or program theory or intervention theory of how we can make the behavior change happen in this context for this population, how to solve it. If you want to see the common tasks and principles in behavior change intervention development frameworks, I signpost you to my talk in the second BESP symposium. And currently, the program theories typically assume causal pathways with separate components linearly associated. But as we've noted, individuals, organizations, behaviors, and interventions are complex, adaptive, and dynamic systems. And therefore, it might not make sense to use this reductionist engineering type of way to create interventions. So really try to, we might need to take more into account these relationships and interconnections in the different parts rather than focus on the individual components. So difference again between complicated interventions and complex interventions. And Patricia Rogers has published a great paper on program theories that can capture the complicated aspects of interventions and complex aspects of interventions, and kind of calling for us to take the aspects into account. For example, recursive causality with reinforcing feedback loops, or these disproportionate nonlinear relationships and emergent outcomes that cannot be predicted. Here is an example from Patricia Rogers' article with the feedback loops feeding back to the to previous stages of the intervention. And here's another talk from a previous BESP symposium from Susan Michie. She's showing system dynamics modeling for housing, energy, and well-being interactions. You can also build these feedback loops, balancing loops between these different aspects of phenomena. So this is, I think, getting more and more ground in modeling interventions. But is it useful? Do complexity features improve efficacy? So Lakum and colleagues had studied type 2 diabetes interventions through the lens of 4 complex systems characteristics. So this learning aspect, that does the intervention take into account that people are active agents who learn and adapt? Does the intervention take into account the interconnections in the system, self-organization and co-evolution, these basic principles? And in fact, they found that those interventions that employ principles of complexity science have improved outcomes. So this might be worth the effort. But then I've noticed that although many interventions and policies have included complex system principles, many intervention development frameworks have not explicitly drawn on these. And I think that these could be integrated in intervention development frameworks as well, and behavior change theories as well. and not use kind of the complex systems approach only as one of the formal theories used as a basis, but really radically shift our perspective and paradigm to account for this different view of humans and behavior. But now this is the question: how to best harness and model and plan for such characteristic of dynamic complex systems in intervention development. I'm super interested in this question, so if any of you know of great papers on this or intervention frameworks that are actually really focused on behavior change intervention design and help make use of complex systems approaches, please send me an email. I want to point out that many of current interventions do take these complex systems aspects into account. So for example, many developers model the behaviors in context and as parts of systems of competing and facilitating behaviors and not individually. And many developers do acknowledge that interventions are more complex than their linear, simplistic logic models. And often we just have to simplify logic models or program theories to clarify kind of the key things for our communication for our stakeholders or for providers, for example. And many times complex systems features are included in the interventions, but not necessarily consciously or explicitly named as such. So for example, Matti Heino went through Let's Move It intervention to promote physical activity that Michie designed a few years ago, and he noted many complex systems characteristics and features in that intervention, even though I had no idea of those characteristics like as part of complexity science perspective. So we kind of intuitively also want to use the complexity principles. But it might not be enough that we intuitively use those complexity principles. There are lots of missed opportunities if we don't explicitly make use of a complex systems approach for intervention development. So I have outlined here some few. So really, do we want to expect these determinants and behavior change relationships to be linear? Is it a reasonable assumption? Is it reasonable to deconstruct these processes to these component parts, determinants and influences? Or try to kind of even more explicitly than now make use of these synergistics in the process. Many of the theories assume synergy, but maybe not as well as we could. And then, are we too much focusing on the components and not their interconnections, and really increasing interconnections of agents also in the system? And is there enough room for self-organization and emergence? So I'm really intrigued by the idea that we should embrace complexity aspects in intervention program theories, but also we need to renew our formal behavior change theories or consider renewing. I'm very close to the end of my presentation, but I want to say a few words about why using complexity lens for behavior change evaluation. So obviously for outcome evaluation, there is limited utility of randomized controlled designs of complex interventions in complex systems. And again, I'm really trying to, because this is the last symposium, I think that I want to, give tips to you of the excellent talks of the previous symposia. So again, Dr. Michael Sanders, who has overseen more than 500 RCTs, was providing some critical views on the limitations of RCTs in his talk. So expanding these evaluation designs that we use is probably very necessary. But also not only looking at outcome evaluation, but also for process evaluation and studying these processes. So Hilbert and Marchand have pointed out that in educational psychology, there are these great theories, but they are not matched with the methods that are used. Although theoretical postulations often describe interaction-dominant phenomena, they are regularly reduced to complicated theoretical models with component-dominant characteristics and then linear empirical testing. And we are making the same kind of comment in a paper led by Matti, that also in behavior change, health behavior change, theory seem to at least implicitly assume the presence of reciprocal causation and feedback loops and intertwined processes, but the empirical testing of such processes has to date been limited. So this is kind of the sad state of affairs. So we are not perhaps thinking very wrongly, but the testing is wrongly. But what I find really comforting to know is that this is just because there haven't been the means yet. So this I learned in Fred Hasselman's course last year. So basically, we have been using statistical methods that have their kind of background in mathematical formalism that was developed hundreds of years ago. And they are great in testing certain types of phenomena. But if we want to look at nonlinear processes or circular causality, interaction dominant dynamics, the mathematical basis for these methods have been actually developed and published. Look at the publication dates. I've been alive for most of the time when these have been published. So it's no wonder that people haven't been using these modeling approaches yet. So, but the good news is that they are there and they can be used. And in this paper, Matti has made some analysis that show some alternative ways to study behavior change mechanisms. This is still under peer review, so that warning. So to sum up, I'm just still wondering which approaches are most suitable for characterizing behavior change phenomena, given these different possible compound mechanisms of actions and intertwining of different processes and synergistic effects and nonlinear effects and time-varying dynamics. Not even to start with the individual variation in the predicted causal relationship. So what might motivate me to social distance is something completely else for my young adult stepchildren, for example. And how can we better theorize and study this in the future? So I'm really hopeful that this symposium from now on will give some insight what this all means to our formal theories, our intervention program theories, logic models, and evaluation designs. So I hope to get many ideas, hope to discuss with all of you in the Slack and Facebook, and probably before going on a short break before continuing with Olli-Pekka Heinonen, there is one question. How could someone start learning about complexity science? Any learning experiences that could help understand complexity? I think that we can, Matti, we could basically, because we could somehow kind of gather, because I have many papers that I have found really immensely useful in trying to get my head around this more. So we could maybe have a list on our website, as a resource list, and then kind of share in that way.
Yeah, definitely. We have a Slack. One of the Slack channels is called Learning Materials and Resources or something like this. So we can collect whatever we can get with whatever during these 2 days we put in there. We can then put those things up on the website also.
Yeah, great.
But if anyone has found any good materials or courses or anything like that, if you're not on Slack, you can send me an email. But if you're on Slack, feel free to post any links to the Learning Materials channel, so we can all benefit from the materials.
Great. I think that we have to have a short break now before the next talk. GJ is asking, and the Slack will keep existing?
Yes, the Slack will keep existing as long as, well, who knows? I don't know if I will exist tomorrow.
Difficult to predict.